business.
Thanks very much, Speaker. Each year when budget night comes around, Mr Speaker, there'll be different things that people hope to have said in the budget speech. We've got this unusual situation now where if you want something to actually happen, the last thing you want is for the government to announce it. Because the moment they announce it, you know it's doomed. You know it doesn't stand a chance. So this year we have to choose between what we might want announced and what we actually want to occur. And it all comes down to a mug. Because when the Prime Minister says, oh, well, no one could have predicted the pandemic, yeah, that's true. But what they forget is they promised a surplus every single budget. And we've now had 6 budgets and they haven't done it once. They say, oh, well, the crisis they're dealing with now is bigger than the global financial crisis. Yeah, but we've had 6 years without a global financial crisis and they've more than doubled the debt. Everything they announced, and when they announced it last year, let's not pretend that it was then the pandemic that was the reason that the announcement didn't come true, because it was back in January when they refused to continue their commitment to a surplus. It was before the coronavirus had reached Australia, before the coronavirus lockdowns had started to hit the economy, that the surplus was already gone. And so what this government is now in a situation of is, on coming to government claiming and announcing that they would deliver a surplus every single time, they never have delivered a surplus. They never will deliver a surplus. They have gone from doubling Australia's debt to now being on track towards $1 trillion of debt for Australia. And every single time they make the announcement, we know what's coming. Because if you want to stop something in this country, the most effective way of stopping it is to get the Prime Minister of this country to announce it. There for the photo op, but never for the follow-up. He's like, if you go into the CBD of Sydney, there's all these old sandstone facades, and you look at the facade, and behind the facade that's being propped up, there's just rubble and a big hole, and every time I look at that rubble, I think the Prime Minister must have announced he was going to build something there, because the facade is all that's there. He's like the kid playing knock and run. And the Australian people come to the front door and think, oh, nothing here, nothing here. It's like you get that scene in that musical, The Sound of Music, where the MC comes up and announces the next act. And the big announcement is the Von Trapp family singers. Nothing. Then they say the family Von Trapp. Still nothing. And before you know it, someone runs on, says they're gone, and the main act is halfway up the hill, hiding behind a tombstone in a convent. Because what this government does every single time now is just riddle the Australian public with announcements. Having made such a mess during the bushfires and realising that the communication strategy wasn't real great from the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that instead they would have a communication strategy and nothing else. Remember, year after year, we normally get in the lead-up to the budget that this is going to be the infrastructure budget. Every year we get told about the infrastructure changes that will happen. And when the Prime Minister today was challenged on the fact that for 6 consecutive budgets what they've announced has never been matched by what they've done, when the member for Ballarat pointed out the $1.7 billion shortfall in what they'd announced compared to what actually happened in the last financial year, what was the Prime Minister's response? To get up a series of talking points and tell us what they'd announced. That isn't the point. They've announced a whole lot of things. They announced, for example, that, and I love this quote, they announced that incoming cruise ships would be put directly under the command of the Australian Border Force. And that announcement was incredibly powerful, unless you were a cruise ship, because for cruise ships, nothing changed. And the public came straight off the Ruby Princess, and what was the Prime Minister's response? Not, well, I announced it and it was meant to happen. Blame the states. Blame someone else. Always find someone else to blame. And often the announcements have become more elaborate. in my the arts portfolio that I've got, we had the announcement where they even got celebrities there. They went to the theatre with the empty chairs, and 100 days later, not a dollar spent. Not a dollar spent. Now, I don't want to be too critical of this because at one level, I do find the Minister for Communication, I want to encourage him. I just want to encourage. There used to be a comedian called Elliot Goblet, whose entire style of humour was to have zero personality, complete monotone. And this bloke's got it nailed. He's really got it nailed, because what he did with the arts announcement, he spent months telling us there was not a problem. He then made the big announcement, delivered nothing, and then returned to saying there's not a problem. But nothing quite comes to the fore. And the poor, I think we all felt a little bit for the Deputy Prime Minister today, because he's not the minister who bought the land. It was the Minister for Communications. So the Minister for Communications was the one who, at the time, when he held the infrastructure portfolio, they announced as a government that they would pursue value for money. So how does the value for money work? You get a property that's worth $3 million. If someone wants, and so it's worth $3 million, you don't own it. So you go to the owner of the $3 million property and say, I'll buy it from you for $30 million, but then you can rent it back from me. But when we rent it back, it won't be worth $30 million. We'll base it on the fact that it's now worth less than $1 million. So if you're buying it, it's worth 30 times the price. If you're renting it, it's a third of the price. It's a third of the price. And what was the response from the Minister for Communications when he was asked about this happening under his watch? He actually stood up at the National Press Club and begged people to believe that he knew nothing about what was going on. Yeah, only a very special minister like that bloke wants you to believe he was asleep at the wheel. And tonight, in the biggest spending budget ever, with Australia facing the biggest debt ever, one of the challenges we have is we know they won't be smart in how they spend the money. It was a perfect question time for the Minister for Energy to take an answer. Perfect question time. Because time after, and I'm still trying to work out with the landscape. It's the first scandal in a while that he hasn't seemed to be part of. So we better check the electoral map. We better check the electoral map, because if there's a scandal and the Minister for Energy is not yet involved, I reckon we haven't all done our homework yet. So we'll make the note for self on that. But when the Prime Minister then, in the outrageous claims about houses on fire, I'm not going to take lectures from a Prime Minister who has overseen the state of aged care and going into this pandemic where right from the start we were told aged care was going to be one of the most at-risk areas. It was already an area that was seen to be doing poorly enough that we had a Royal Commission, and yet we discover they didn't even have a plan. And we have the hundreds of deaths in aged care for a government that the Royal Commission, and let's not forget, it's not like they can claim that the Royal Commissioners were poorly chosen. They chose them, they've looked at this, and they are the ones who are coming back with there being no plan for aged care. The bushfire clean-up is probably the most horrific of all the examples. To have a circumstance where they announced a $2 billion bushfire recovery fund, most of that money is still locked away. They then thought, oh, we'd better do something, so they announced a further $4 billion emergency response fund. 18 months later, not $1 spent. Tonight's budget, let's face it, it is important to the nation what they do, but all we will get tonight is what they announce. And for the last 6 budgets, we have seen a government that gets every number wrong and fails to deliver what they announced.